Have you ever wanted to get involved in real estate development, but didn't know where to begin? Do you think real estate development is only for the large hedge funds or major corporations, the big guys? Or have you done some development in the past and are looking to scale up? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then this podcast is for you. Welcome to the W.I.R.E.D Wealth and Real Estate Development Podcast. I am your host, Nick Smith. Get ready to have your mind blown and rewired as we discuss all aspects of creating wealth and real estate development. Good day, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whenever you all are listening to this. I am your host, Nick Smith, and this is the W.I.R.E.D Wealth and Real Estate Development Podcast. Definitely want to encourage everyone, if you're getting any value out of this episodes, whether you're on YouTube, whether you're listening to it, wherever you listen to podcasts, please like, share, subscribe. It would definitely go a long way in helping me to spread this real estate development message. Again, if you're on podcasts, feel free to subscribe. And if you're on YouTube, feel free to comment, like, and share. Today, I have a very, very, very special guest with me on our episode, and this is episode number 13. The guest that I have today is none other than Miss Raquel Favela. Raquel Favela is the Executive Managing Director of Technical Advisory and Training with the National Development Council. And we're going to get into who and what the National Development Council is. I've known Raquel for a long time, for a good amount of time, probably close to about 15 years or so now. When we originally met, I was an employee with the city of East Chicago, and she was one of our consultants with the National Development Council, and she has been a valued mentor, valued friend, and just a great person throughout my years of knowing her. So Raquel, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Nicholas. I'm so happy to be here and so proud of you for your work as a developer and your growth there, and then for your podcast. I'm so excited for you.
As I told you offline, I had good teachers, and you were one of those good teachers. So I definitely appreciate you coming on. If you can, give us just a synopsis or the brief version of your background, who you are, where you're from, and what you do.
Sure. So I am really lucky enough to have been spending almost 3 decades now working in the community and economic development space. I started out working for a little nonprofit in San Antonio, Texas, NeighborWorks San Antonio, back before the days of GPS and GIS systems. I was in charge of helping plan new communities for NHS San Antonio. So everything from site assessment. So we used to drive around neighborhoods and assess different vacant properties, and had to go do research on ownership the old-fashioned way, go back to county records and dig through plats and review what had potential, and then send out good old-fashioned snail mail letters until we could assemble enough lots and sites to build subdivisions. And then my role after that was to create the neighborhood association, the homeowners association, and help form the governance for the homeowners association, get them started, first meeting, elect officials, and then hand it over to them to run the subdivision. Then I went and spent probably the next 10 years or so at the local government, heading up all of the local financing, gap financing programs and redevelopment programs at local government. And then went to work for NDC, because I learned so much through them on financing and federal tools. So I became the advisor for lots of units of government, including East Chicago, and then took a sabbatical and went to help the city of Dallas, and then came back to NDC to help them expand their technical advisory services into a more strategic planning effort. So we added to our technical advisory services and to include not just transactions on financing, structuring, but also comprehensive planning, housing strategies, policy development, and program administration. So we've been expanding our TA work just in time for COVID, because during COVID, we basically spent the last 3 years helping communities deploy COVID resources. So we're at about $1 billion deployed right now, COVID resources all across the country. So NDC is both a technical advisor as a nonprofit organization, and then we also have 2 CDFI arms. So we are a 7A lender through our Grow America Fund, and then we have a community investment loan fund that is also a community loan fund.
And for those that may not know what CDFI stands for, what is a CDFI?
It's a community development financial institution. So it is a bank, a community bank, but instead of operating off of member deposits like your bank, savings deposits, checking deposits, we work off of community investments. So a client, usually a unit of government, city, county, state government, would hire NDC to establish a loan fund for them that will help them accomplish their community or small business lending goals. So depending on the type of loan fund they want to establish, we might use our Grow America Fund, or we might use our SILF fund. So frankly, we might establish a proprietary fund that doesn't utilize either of those vehicles. We might just set up an individual proprietary fund for a client. And that's really how we set up a lot of these COVID recovery programs. So because they weren't exactly loans, they were more grants or conditional grants. So we set up individual community development entities to help deploy those funds.
Awesome. We were talking offline as I was finishing up, because I started a certification progress that, your organization, I started many years ago, but wasn't able to finish it until 2020. And I took the last class literally the week before the state of Pennsylvania shut everything down, and the certificate is a housing development finance professional. And, it was a blessing to go through that course and to take that class. You actually were the instructor. I remember one of the 4 classes that I took. Give the listeners, if you don't mind, some background into who NDC is, what it is NDC does, and kind of what's your mission at National Development Council.
Yes, so we are the oldest nonprofit technical advisory service organization in this space in community development. We were established in 1968, and our core mission is really to build capacity in underserved communities and to make capital more readily available to those communities. That's our primary goal. So most people who get to know NDC first get to know us through our professional certification program, like the Housing Development Finance. We also have an Economic Development Finance professional certification program. So it's really the nuts and bolts of how to pay for housing developments, home buyer underwriting and home buyer financing. And then on the economic development side, how to finance small businesses and commercial developments, right? Commercial redevelopment projects. And then everything that goes with that. So all the federal funding sources that are used as sources of capital to fill gaps in those types of projects, and all the creation of program policies and administration operating manuals for that. And then, like I said, we now have added to our core services how to create a strategic plan in a community, so with an equity lens, right, to how to deploy that and reach the most marginalized communities. So I was really proud of our ability to do that with COVID, where they might have had another contractor or service provider who had tried to deploy COVID funds, but couldn't reach the businesses and the families that really were in need, right? Because it's really easy to deploy PPP if you have a banking relationship, because your bank will process. but NDC was able to reach the small businesses who were the barber shop, the nail tech, the, event planner, the sole proprietors that really had a need for their funds and who needed guidance in how to complete the application and how to get all of their subcontractors to complete the applications. So we were processing applications for as small as $5,000, where others were only dealing with, anyone who was submitting a request for 20,000 or more. Really, the lowest we saw was 10,000 or more. We were doing small applications. We even processed a few that were $500
Wow.
requests. So it's labor intensive, but that's our goal. We are a community bank, and that's our mission: skills transfer and making capital available to communities that are in need. So I love the work. I've been at NDC now 16 years, and I love it. I love it. It's a great mission.
Gotcha. Now, correct me if I'm wrong too, but NDC does also sometimes partner, with communities and or developers to do certain development projects or developments in certain communities, correct?
We do. There's the side of NDC where we are building capacity and we are training folks either on the job or in a classroom. And then there's the side where we are offering financing tools. So we have our financing arm like the SILF and GAF and then other unique funds that we create. But then there's a different, specialized programs where we will partner either at the request of a client. Let's say a municipality has hired us and they need someone to develop affordable housing and they don't have anyone else in the space who's doing it. Our goal, again, is always to be true to our mission and partner with either an existing nonprofit and help them build that capacity. So we will be a co-developer with them, or to take someone who's gone through NDC training or bring them to NDC developer training. So we have something called the SEED Academy, Supporting Emerging Empowered Developers Academy, where they can learn to be a developer, and then NDC will help them realize a development project. And that's usually through a local sponsor. So the typical local sponsor might be a bank, a financial institution, or a regulatory agency like Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, someone like that. Those are the typical sponsors of a SEED Academy in a market. But the idea is we want to grow the landscape of minority and women developers in communities. We want to grow our own communities, so and build wealth while we're doing it.
That's the name. That's the reason I started this podcast: wealthy communities,
Right.
wealthy families, and wealthy individuals. They all go together. They go hand in hand.
That's right.
If you have wealthy families and you have wealthy individuals, your community is going to be wealthy.
And no reason why we shouldn't be developing our own communities, right? We don't have to import that talent, because at the end of the day, the likelihood is that we have a role, even if it's just one component of development, but we are involved in that ecosystem. So why not just learn the entirety of it and do it in our own community, right? So whether you're a trade person or you're a realtor, you're a broker, you're a, maybe you've just been working on the transaction side and you've been working the titles side of it, or you're, why not learn the whole and become a developer of housing or commercial sites yourself? So absolutely.
No, I 100% agree. So as I was going through and getting my certification, I'll never forget, and this was before I even started the process, I'll never forget one of the first meetings you had. I don't know if you remember the Carnegie project that we were working on.
Yes.
They did finally get that up and going. It's a performing arts center. But you came and did a presentation on the Carnegie Performing Arts Center, because it was an old library. It was one of old Andrew Carnegie libraries, one of the ones that he built throughout the country.
Yes.
And this property had been vacant and abandoned for forever, for decades. It had been vacant and abandoned. The city wanted to turn it into a performing arts center. And I remember you coming in, giving this presentation on how the city could potentially use new market tax credits on it.
Correct.
And of course, I just sat in the meeting nodding my head and saying, yes, I understood everything, but I had no clue what the heck? New market tax credit, all of these terms and stuff was floating around in that meeting. I didn't know what was going on. I think by the time the meeting ended, I started getting a faint idea of what was being presented. But it was all totally brand new. And this space in particular, this economic development, community development, affordable housing space is a very specialized space. It's a truly specialized space. But I say that to say, those arms and those tax credits are available, in a lot of communities to be used for certain projects. Can you give just kind of a brief overview on, first of all, what are some of the tax credits that are available, the most widely used, and what they can be used for?
Sure. So the key is there's a whole alphabet soup, right, of tax credits to incentivize real estate development where the market doesn't naturally produce the type of return that it would require to make the deal attractive to an investor developer. Mm-hmm. So the tax credit becomes the real carrot, the real incentive, because it will offer the incentive that either the dollar for dollar reduction in tax liability, and potentially it will offer both. It will provide a source of equity to bring the transaction to fruition, right? So on the operations side, you might end up benefiting from the tax credit, right? In some cases, like renewable energy credits. On the development side, you need a credit, the value of a tax credit for the benefit of, developing a type of project that you can sell to someone who needs a tax reduction. And so if your project located in East Chicago, as an example, would generate tax credits, and New Markets is an easy example. Let's say that you have a project that's $10 million in total development costs, and New Market tax credits basically generates, 20% roughly of your total development costs. That gives you the opportunity to sell tax credits to a pool of investors or an equity fund in exchange, right, for that tax reduction. So very wealthy, investors invest in those funds. You sell them that tax credit. You use their cash to complete your project. Mm-hmm. So you effectively will only have to figure out, not that it's not a huge amount, but $8 million roughly of that $10 million you have to finance and use your own equity or find other sources of gap finance. And then 2 million rather will come from that tax credit equity that you obtain from that investor. So in the same way, there are a number of other tax credits. There's historic tax credits. So that's specifically for the redevelopment of buildings like the Carnegie Building, right? Mm-hmm. So, the goal of raising this capital for historic buildings is, of course, the preservation of the historic asset. So as in the case with the Carnegie Building, doesn't necessarily mean that it has to operate in the same way. Mm-hmm. It's just to return the building to a useful purpose and preserve to some standard set by the National Park Service, where they monitor the standards for the redevelopment of that building. And so it's a very lengthy process, very similar to the New Markets tax credit. Depending on the nature of the redevelopment, you can apply, you can be eligible for up to 20% or a 10% credit. And then there are also some, that's the federal credit. There are also some states that have passed state credits as well. And then there are also some municipalities that have adopted local historic preservation credits. The local historic preservation credits might be something like fee waivers or an accelerated permit process or a freezing of property values. So, it's worth checking into what levels of credits are available. But the federal ones for sure are available to any property that is on the National Register or a contributing structure.
I was going to ask you that. Did it have to be a property for the historic tax credit? It had to be a property registered on the federal registry as a historic property.
It does, or it has to be a contributing structure to a historic district. So
what does that actually mean?
It means that it can be eligible to be on the register, but not yet on the register, and it is a contributing structure. So there is definitely on the National Park Service an inventory of all of the eligible properties. So if you ever have a question about whether your property is eligible for it, you just pop in the address at the National Park Service and Historic Tax Credits, and it will tell you whether the property is eligible for the historic tax credit.
Gotcha.
So, and then there are other requirements with the historic tax credit regarding ownership, right? So the owner has to have owned that property for the 10 years prior. So you can't qualify for the credit if you sell it. So better to get that credit right as you are, before you make that transfer. So it's important to keep that in mind as you are anticipating selling a structure. And then there are renewable energy tax credits. Again, those are going to vary depending on your state and local building codes. So it's important to see what your local unit of government has adopted in terms of a building code. So there are units of government that have adopted a standard international building code with the most basic requirements, and usually those are mandatory for commercial buildings. And then most of the ones related to residential buildings are voluntary. And so that's where units of government will add their local requirements, right? So they can always add requirements at the local level. They just can't decrease the federal requirements. So it's important to check which building codes and what renewable energy requirements you have. And now, the EPA, the Department of Energy, and, the Department of Transportation are really collaborating with the administration, the White House administration, in reducing gas emissions. So they've really got a lot of funding available now and are releasing a lot of funding opportunities for projects that help us meet our clean energy goals as a country by 2030. So look for a lot of new opportunities on the horizon over the next year for sure, and through the next 6 years. So lots of opportunities for innovation in green energy.
Wow. No, that is interesting. A colleague and I literally were just talking about that today, how one of the automakers has their initiative to be completely electric by 2030. I think that is very aggressive. Will it actually happen? It's going to be interesting to see, because we see a ton of gas stations still currently being built in our area. So it's going to be interesting to see.
It will be, but I think what you'll start to see is, along with those gas stations, you'll see the proliferation of charging stations.
Yes.
Because the funding for those is going to get deployed over the next 6 months. So
Agreed.
You'll start to see that funding become available. And, I think as someone who's sitting in a state where we have had 105 plus degree weather for weeks on end, we've got to do something, right? This is not sustainable to not do something about climate change. And we better do something at every level, really. So in our construction, so if you have an opportunity, by the way, to ever visit HUD's annual building competition, which they do at the National Mall, they have all the builders come out and show all the new building technology. It's really fascinating. All of the green technology and the new innovation they're bringing to home construction is just impressive, right? At all price points. So it's really exciting. I think it's time we do smart building for people because it improves affordability over time, right? It's one thing to build a home, but if we can reduce the cost of owning the home through the lowering the cost of, energy consumption, water consumption, all of those things makes it affordable for our families. So
Right.
we need to figure those things out.
Right. And, I kind of see it. I see it on both sides of the coin now, especially being a commercial broker, because a lot of your builders would not mind going to that extreme to make your homes completely green, energy efficient, and things like that. But it typically drives up your construction costs.
That's right. Absolutely.
And I think that's where some of these credits actually come into play. It makes it feasible at that point because without those, without those green initiatives and green requirements, I mean, I can build a home for this, but now if you tack on what I have to do to make it like that, then it becomes a lot more expensive.
That's right. And so that's really the goal of NDC, right, is to bridge that knowledge gap between the public sector sources of gap financing and purveyors of tax credits and equity and the developers, right? Because what you've described is exactly right. And the goal of placing these regulatory requirements should never be to make it more difficult for you to achieve a profit margin. That's never the goal. The goal is we want to build a better, more sustainable community, and we understand that's going to cost more. But the role of government in this case is to mitigate that cost so that it doesn't get passed on to our target market, right? So that the cost is borne through these incentive programs, right? And we pass on the credits to the high net wealth individuals who need those tax write-offs. So we're using their money, giving them the tax write-offs, and we're getting the benefit of their cash, their equity, to bridge the gap between what it costs and the profit margin you need to reach. So absolutely, it's a great way, really, if you think about it, of using public resources and leveraging private investment. And again, building wealth, because we don't want to impede a small business like yours in achieving profits.
Right.
We're all about helping you build your business and growing. So absolutely.
Right. So we talked about new market tax credits, the historic tax credits, and then also the renewable energy tax credits. But one I remember that we talked about a lot as I was going through my class was what we call LIHTCs. And LIHTCs are low-income housing tax credits. Give us an overview of what LIHTCs are and how they operate.
So there's two, I guess technically could be described as three types, if you will, of low-income housing tax credits, because there's a 9% and a 4%, but the 9% could be bifurcated into two different types, right? New construction and a rehab. So the 9% new construction is sort of self-explanatory. It's for any development of brand new construction of low-income housing tax credits, right? So it's got to target low income, and that is defined by the IRS as targeting folks that are 60% or below of AMI. And it's got to be at least 40% of the units that are targeting, 60%. So you've got to, meet the criteria there, but also you've got to look at your state housing finance agencies qualified allocation plan, right? And a QAP is just a fancy way of saying annual application, right? It's their annual application round. Because every year that state housing finance agency has different priorities and different scoring criteria, because they're trying to incentivize the different types of projects and different locations, geographic locations, priorities for their geographic area. So it might be that one year you score higher if you're in a rural area versus an urban area and vice versa. Or if you have a project that incorporates, for example, green building technology, or that is really making use of income averaging so that you're not concentrating poverty in one area. So really, they're trying to stay away from 100% low income in already depressed areas. So bringing mixed income into communities is really important. And then you have, and the thing with 9% tax credits, regardless of whether they are new construction or rehabilitation, is that they are highly competitive, right? They're very competitive. This QAP, or annual application round, is very competitive. So 1 point in your application could make the difference between getting funded and not funded. So usually what developers do is basically work their way backwards. Once they've identified and looked at the scoring rubric for the QAP that year, they'll look at all their potential development sites that they control, and they'll see which ones will score the highest, and those are the ones that they'll submit applications for.
Gotcha.
Because those are the ones that are the most likely to get funded, and they understand that per region within the scope of the Housing Finance Agency, 1 or 2 projects are going to get funded annually. So, it's very, very competitive. Then you've got the 4% type of light tech. That one's not competitive per se, in that it's not subject to that QAP. But what it is subject to is the state's bonding capacity, private activity bonding capacity. So that's the caveat there. It's competitive in that way, in that you have to be first come, first serve, qualified to get to that bonding capacity. So the only difference is that the 9% generates 9% credits on the total eligible basis of the development cost. 4% generates 4% of eligible basis. So obviously 9% is more competitive because it generates more tax credits that then get sold in exchange for equity. And the 4% obviously generate less, but saves you time because they're not as competitive and you can apply at any time. So if you've got a smaller deal, usually 4% tax credit is the route that most of the LIHTC developers will go. And you compare a 4%, for example, with historic tax credits, and that usually will bridge that gap that would have been met with a 9%. So, it's good to evaluate your deal both ways. If you really have a huge rehab transaction that you're trying to get, I always say go for the 9% first. If it doesn't get done, then at least you have your application ready to go for a 4% deal with some modifications.
Gotcha. So Raquel, and I'm speaking on behalf of my newer developers that may be listening, this all seems so complicated. Sounds like a whole world in it of itself. What would incentivize, or what would cause a developer to want to go through the hurdles? Let's just be for real.
The brain damage.
Yeah, exactly. That's a better way of putting it. The brain damage to get access to these tax credits.
Well, there's a number of reasons to do it, right? The hardest deal you'll ever do is the first one, right? It's the first deal is always going to be the hardest. Once you get yourself comfortable with, the mechanics of just the timelines for applications, who's involved at the city level, at the state level, because there's a whole process. So once you get comfortable with that, you're halfway there. It's just understanding who the players are and what the deadlines are. The reason you would want to go through that brain damage is, here's the reality. Anything that is going to be subsidized by the government has to offer a better than market return, right? Because if the open and competitive market is offering an IRR of 10% or 12%, then these programs have to offer a better than. So most states, for example, through the LIHTC program, have some kind of cap, but it's capped at 15%. So you're earning a better than market return in exchange for the brain damage of going through their process. And then once you get in the routine and the experience of doing these, honestly, it just becomes a lot easier to do the transactions. And you may become the expert in your market that others want to partner with. So you then become the one to offer the expertise, and you have others go through the brain damage of doing the actual applications. So you just, are working hard the first, few times you're doing it for a better than market return.
Right.
A lot of wealth building can happen there.
Right. And I definitely do remember with the low income housing tax credits in the pro forma, which is your model of how the project will operate. It does actually allow, even in your budget, a pretty nice developer subsidy or developer fee that you can get in. I mean, your typical for-profit developer fee may only be 5 to 6%, whereas with the low income housing tax credit, I believe you can go all the way up to 12%, as a developer fee for going through the brain damage of a project like this.
And remember, as the owner developer, you can choose to play different roles in the transaction to the extent allowed by law in your state, right? Because there are some identities of interest that are limited by your state, but you could be the owner developer, so you can earn a developer fee. You can also be the property manager and earn a property management fee. You can also manage the partnership, so you could be the partnership management fee, right? So there's a lot of opportunity to earn more than just the developer fee. So for all the minority developers that are, thinking about this, absolutely, my recommendation is training, right? So W.I.R.E.D Academy, but also there are lots of other comparable nonprofit partners who have equitable developer academies out there. So get training on it, because it is important to have a working understanding of development first, and then the different financing tools. And then it doesn't hurt to find a mentor partner in the development space. I think that's key. And that's frankly the way that we operate our W.I.R.E.D Academy, is we identify local mentors in each of the markets that will work with our academy participants and will agree to mentor them through their development deals.
Awesome. Yeah, you and I, we're going to talk about that W.I.R.E.D Academy some more, I know. So
yeah.
Definitely. We talked about this offline, how I kind of was ushered into this space, so to speak. I had a good friend who was a church member. She was working for the East Chicago Department of Redevelopment at that time. And I had just graduated college. I graduated college in 2008. The world was literally falling apart in 2008. Everything was
you've been
crumbling.
through some big changes.
So it was an interesting time period, and it just happened, during that time frame. They were looking to bring somebody a little bit younger. She was looking for some help at that time. And I got exposed to this world, of affordable housing, economic development, just community development. But this is not talked about, mainstream. This is not a career path that when you go to job fairs, you typically don't see these type of companies, at your job fairs and things like that. Why do you think that is, and how do you think that can be changed?
Well, one is because generally in our communities, STEM in general is just underrepresented, right? The sciences, technology, engineering and math. And I can always tell when I teach a class for NDC, I can tell when someone comes from unfortunately, from our public education system, because they are very fearful of math, right? And I can tell you that as an instructor at NDC, I will have gotten at least a handful of emails in advance of class from participants that are saying, hey, I just want to warn you, I have math anxiety. So we've got to do something about that in this country.
I was one of those.
Yeah, I mean, it's not unusual, right? And so we need to do better about helping communities of color and attracting them to the STEM fields. But also because finance itself is so misunderstood, right? We have this big giant category of finance. There's so much underneath the umbrella of finance. So there's public finance, there's real estate finance, there's, small business finance, there's a whole bunch of, investment finance. There's a whole bunch of other subfields in that. So we don't do a good enough job of explaining what finance careers could be. There's a lot that can happen there. So as NDC, we really are trying to change that we have our professional certification program, because as you know, in local government, you just kind of get thrown assignments, right? Somebody go solve for this, and here, go build this and figure it out on your own, how to do that. I was in those shoes. And the other part of it is, in the nonprofit space, they're mission oriented organizations. They want to do right by the communities, but they never quite know where to go get the skill sets, right? The nuts and bolts skill sets to put that together, the deals together. So oftentimes what they end up doing is hiring that expertise, which is great, except for you still have to know how to manage the people you hire. And how do you know they're, doing right by you? So you have to know enough to manage them. So at NDC, through our professional certification, our classroom training, and then also we've created internships and fellowships at NDC now. So we've gone one step beyond that. So if you're at a college, either undergraduate or graduate program, and you're trying to figure out if this is a space you want to work in professionally, we give you the opportunity to come in and work alongside a field director who's providing technical assistance to clients and really work in that space. And so we try to customize the program for the intern or fellow depending on what they're interested in. So if they're interested more in economic development or housing or strategic planning, we try to pair them up with the field director that has the appropriate client portfolio so that they get exposure to that kind of work. That to me is meaningful and real knowledge transfer, because that is going to be the next best employee in the public sector in the nonprofit space. So I think that's our real contribution to the field. And we specifically go to universities and recruit people of color. So that's our goal, is to expand the field by adding professionals of color to the space. And we're excited because we've been able to grow those programs. We have now relationships with 4 universities, top tier universities across the country. And so we've been able to produce some really high quality professionals. Some we've retained at NDC, and frankly, some we've been able to help find jobs at cities in our client community. So it's a win-win as far as we're concerned. We want to help out.
No, that is, I mean, it's amazing because, after I became, employed at the city of East Chicago level, you start seeing that, I mean, pretty much every municipality, every government entity, they all have some type of economic development, some type of arm. It could be on a county level, could be on an individual city level, but there is some type of economic development, redevelopment, community development, some type of arm in that municipality that's doing something, and if you don't get exposed to it, you never know that it's there. I'm just grateful that I did actually get exposed to it, early in my career, it was very early in my career.
Same. My exposure to NDC was the result of one of my I was actually in graduate school at the time, and I had a research methods course, and as part of my research methods course, I was doing program evaluations of every single one of the programs that I was in charge of at my municipal job. And so every semester I would choose a different program that we were going to evaluate. One would be evaluated by my graduate class I was in, and another one I would procure through my, a professional to come and do an evaluation. So one of my programs was a neighborhood commercial revitalization program. And the assessment came in and they said, you know what you really lack in the program, both at the staff level and the organizations you're funding, is you don't have anybody with real estate finance expertise. And I said, okay, great. And they had some other programmatic recommendations. So I started to go out to my local bank partners and asking them, I need your help. Do you have a loaned executive program, or do you have programs that you would recommend? And Citibank at the time said, we have a program for you. And they introduced me to NDC. So 3 of us went out and we basically went and subjected ourselves to the brain damage of the first NDC class. And honestly, 2 hours into it, we messaged our colleagues back at the office and said, cancel the rest of your week, whatever you've got, you're coming to the rest of this class.
Wow.
And the rest was history, because we felt that strongly that the NDC training was really what we had been missing at our programs. And since then, that unit of government still is sending people to NDC training. It's just merely, in my opinion, and like I said, I don't say it because I work here. It was because before, when I was at municipal government, it's like somebody finally put the pieces of the puzzle together for me. And I was like operating that whole time with pieces of the puzzle missing. So I felt like, oh, now I see the full picture of this real estate development stuff.
Right.
I get it.
Right.
It's been very helpful.
No, I've always admired, since I've got exposed to what NDC does, I've always admired NDC, the training and the assistance we've gotten, or I've gotten throughout the years has been invaluable for sure. I know you work with a lot of different communities, a lot of different, stakeholders, even different developers. And the development industry as a whole does have some challenges now. I mean, we talk about the affordability piece. We talk about, just some of the cost factors, inflation, all of that type of things. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing really right now, with some of your developers, that really do want to get into this or already are active into this space of development?
Biggest one that we hear about is access to capital, right? Is cost of capital is high, so they need other sources of capital that they can access especially for pre-development activities, because in current times, with things being as unstable, everyone, right, is concerned about preserving their own cash for emergencies. And so because they're just now starting to put their reserves back together, because people depleted all of their cash reserves during COVID. A lot of small businesses had to dip into their reserves when things slowed down. So they're needing to, not dip into their cash as deeply as they would have ordinarily. Even though there's a robust real estate market, everyone's feeling uncertain about what might happen. Right. And then you pair that up with some markets where there's some staleness in building or development codes, right? They haven't caught up with the changes that need to happen, right? Where parking requirements haven't really matched up with today's realities, right? And pairing up with public transportation availability and, other things that we clearly know now. Not everyone is going to come down, for example, to a central business district to park, because people are just not officing in their commercial districts anymore. So there needs to be some modification to some of the basic building codes that will help accelerate the production of housing. So if you look at the federal Housing Accelerator Initiative, there's a lot of incentives for removing those barriers to the construction of housing. So I would say funding will become available for those kinds of things. And so it will make that pre-development fund available for developers. So I think help is on the way. Honestly, I feel like organizations like NDC, we need to help build that capacity of every emerging developer that has an interest in doing this, because to me, that's the most important part. Is we need to be developing our own communities. We're the ones who live there. We're the ones who should have a say in what the space looks like and who's going to invest in the best, in higher quality than us, right? We're not going to invest in disposable, units. We're going to invest in the very highest quality if we live there. So
100%.
I think just build, we need to build capacity so that everyone can be a part of building back our housing supply.
100%. Well, Raquel, we're coming up on time, and I told you I was going to keep you on target. I know you have another meeting to attend, but I definitely want to thank you again for your time. It has been my honor. It's been a pleasure. If people would like to get in touch with you, learn more about the CE program and what NDC is doing, what is the best way for them to reach out to you?
Sure, absolutely. They can reach me via email at rfavela@ndconline.org, or they can visit our website, which will lead them to me, and that's ndconline.org.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. You all, this has been an outstanding episode, again, with Raquel Favela. This is episode number 13 of the Wired podcast. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you've learned anything or gotten anything from this episode, please, again, like, subscribe, share. It will definitely tremendously help us in getting this message across to the world. Let's go out and build our communities, and let's get wired up. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please share this content with someone else who would benefit from it. I'm looking forward to having you with me on the next episode. Now go out and create some wealth and real estate development.